What's up, class? So we are on 6.2. We're going to be talking about the spatial organization of cities. So for this objective, you need to be able to explain the processes that initiate and drive urbanization and suburbanization. Sorry, my little pup here is a little whiny. So we have megacities and metacities. I'll show you guys Addie here real quick since he's being a little whiner. Megacities and metacities. These are distinct spatial outcomes of urbanization and increasingly located in countries of the periphery and the semi-periphery. So I know we've mentioned periphery and semi-periphery before. Periphery, these are countries that are typically producers. So we think of them as being more like of the lower income countries, and then semi-periphery have elements of both. They produce, but they also consume. So let's say places like Mexico. Also, we're going to look at processes of urbanization, sprawl, and decentralization. So things like edge cities, exurbs, and boomburgs, and the new challenges that those pose. So for a megacity, these are metropolitan areas with populations of more than 10 million people. In 2018, so slightly outdated, there were 33 megacities, with about half located in the periphery and semi-periphery areas of Asia and Africa. So for population growth of these places, we tend to see birth rates that are over the replacement level, so higher birth rates. And then we also see this rural to urban migration as well. This also has resulted in unplanned city growth with squatter settlements, which is one thing that we mentioned in the previous objective. So we also have metacities now. Those are metropolitan areas with populations of more than 20 million people in a single city. So think of like Beijing, Shanghai. That is just an absurd amount of people for one city. And if we take a look at this here, hopefully you guys have been taking note of these. We see these top 20 cities by population shifting over time. So we're starting to see them more so in parts of Asia and Africa and less in the more developed world. Over time, right? So we have urban sprawl and decentralization. So this right here is exactly as that, urban sprawl. So being able to spread out from city centers, sprawling out from city centers. And because of transportation technology like the automobile, roads, commercial developments, that has expanded from the city core and outward. So oftentimes this has been unplanned, which results in poor infrastructure and connections over time. This is actually pretty common in US metropolitan areas where they're just growing so much and so fast. We start to see areas of urban sprawl, and we see new land use forms. So suburbs, edge cities, boomburgs, and exurbs. So we're going to go through each one of those. So first, suburbanization. This is the process of people moving, usually from cities to residential areas on the outskirts of cities. So they tend to form communities that are connected to the city for jobs and services, but are decentralized or just not in the center. So people will still work in city centers, but they just commute from their suburban areas into the urban areas where they work. These are less densely populated and also less ethnically diverse in cities. These developed due to advancements in transportation that allowed people to live further than just walking distance from their jobs. So we see this especially with families. Young people or young couples will then move from urban areas to suburban areas to raise their family because usually buying a house is cheaper and property is cheaper. Sometimes there's better schools, things like that. So after World War II in the US, economic advancements, something called the GI Bill, and also increased production and ownership of automobiles, along with the Federal Aid Highway Act, we start to see an increase of suburbs. So it looks like this, like just all these little houses that are the same, sprawled out over an area. The GI Bill, this is something that provided veterans, so soldiers that come back from war, with low down payment terms and also long-term mortgages for their housing. So it was super easy for them to buy houses. The GI Bill also provided them with free college. So They would get educated, get really good deals on houses, and we start to see this like boom of suburban areas. So neighborhoods were developed with tract/prefab housing that could be built quickly. So this is what it means by prefab. So these are homes that are prefabricated. So you start to see like areas that look exactly the same. So this idea of, let's say, the 1950s housewife type era, where everybody had a home that was almost the same, and all the husbands would get into the cars and drive into the city for work. That's kind of this era that prompted that sort of stereotype. So continuing on terms related to the development of suburban areas, we have edge cities. So just like that term sounds, these are communities located on the outskirts or the edges of a larger city with commercial centers, office space, retail complexes, and amenities typically found in an urban center. So these places are like, they have everything you need and that you would find in an urban center, but they're their own area out on the edge. So these are usually not residential. It's mostly economic activities, but they do service an area surrounding them that is residential. This is something that we've seen happen in the past 30 years, more or less. So if we take a look at this example here, this is the Washington, D.C. area. Here we have Washington business districts, the West End and the East End separated here. And then that's right here. Just outside of that, so just outside of DC, we then have this Tyson's Corner that has become an edge city. So if we look at the amount of commercial office space that has been used more recently since 1993, between here and Washington, D.C., we see this growth of the Tyson's Corner area. So continuing on terms related to the development of suburban areas, we also have boomburgs. These are suburbs that have grown rapidly into a large and sprawling city with more than 100,000 residents. These are typically made up of planned communities that have begun to merge together. So it feels suburban, but it's more closely related to an urban city in a population. So these are some examples, like over here in Texas, we have some areas just outside of Houston, just outside of Austin, just outside of San Antonio. So these resemble a urban area, and they do house quite a few people. And then finally, we have exurgs. These are communities on the outside edge of traditional suburbs. So not on the outside of urban areas, but on the outside of suburban areas. And these function like a suburb, but with more rural and less connected to the city's central core. So a little bit further out, more space in between, far lower density. Sometimes these are wealthy estates where people can have like huge tracts of land, or small rural towns. And also these tend to have less diversity than urban centers. So along with that, this idea of decentralization and the challenges that come along with this, with urbanization, we have something called placelessness, and this is the lack of identity or culture. So we have like this modern culture that kind of takes over places and replaces the uniqueness with, you know, something that we tend to see, like the same types of buildings or the same types of businesses. This is through the dependence on automobiles, this results in pollution and also traffic congestion. So definitely a big issue of urbanization. Economically exclusive. So often those who remain in the city are in poverty and do not pay enough taxes to sustain the urban core. So as people gain more wealth, they tend to move to suburban areas. So in the US, that's linked to property taxes, and that's why those schools are better in some cases. And inner city or urban schools don't have as much funding, and they tend to also be associated with poverty. This leads to an economic decline and urban decay. Government investment in continued suburban growth also resulted in a lack of investment in inner cities. So as governments are starting to prompt more suburban growth or growth outside of the central part of the city, we see the central part or the inner city not having the same kind of economic investments. So that was 6.2, and